Good morning. I am Trudy Muscat, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this podcast, part of a series run by the International Fiscal Association Malta branch, chaired by Chris Curmi. IFA aims to facilitate insightful discussions on international and domestic tax developments while providing a platform for exchange of perspectives across the profession. We are particularly grateful to Sigma World Malta for sponsoring and hosting this podcast series and for supporting initiatives that promote knowledge sharing and professional engagement within the tax community. I am Women in IFA's Malta representative. WIN is a network within the International Fiscal Association dedicated to fostering connection, visibility and professional development for women across the international tax community. WIN brings together professionals from diverse backgrounds and jurisdictions to encourage dialogue, mentorship and collaboration while contributing to a more inclusive and representative tax profession. I have the pleasure today to be joined by Mariella Caruana, Deputy Director for Taxation at BusinessEurope. Thank you for joining me, Mariella.
Thank you very much, Trudy, and thank you for that introduction. Thanks to you, to IFA Malta branch, and thanks to Sigma World Malta for hosting today's podcast. It's my pleasure to be here to be discussing taxation. I know it is a topic that we both love discussing, but it's also something that I love doing outside of Brussels because we have many debates taking place in Brussels that at the end of the day impact the business and the economic realities of businesses that are operating outside of Brussels. And so it is my pleasure to be here. I think this is a very important platform that you have built, and I am pleased to be here to contribute to the discussion.
You're most welcome. So in today's podcast, Mariella has kindly accepted to share Business Europe's stance on a number of simplification and competitiveness initiatives undertaken by the EU. Business Europe is the leading representative organization for enterprises in Europe, bringing together national business federations from across the EU and advocating on policies affecting competitiveness, investment, taxation, trade and economic growth at a European level. It regularly engages with the European Commission and EU institutions on legislative and regulatory initiatives impacting the European business community. Mariella, in this vein, Business Europe has published its position on the European Commission's simplification omnibus packages, which frame tax and regulatory simplification as a central pillar of the EU's broader competitiveness agenda following the September 2024 Mario Draghi Report on the future of European competitiveness. So building on Draghi's warning that Europe faces declining productivity, excessive regulatory fragmentation and an estimated annual investment gap of 750 to 800 billion euros, the Omnibus initiatives seek to reduce compliance burdens, streamline reporting obligations, and create a more investment-friendly environment across the single market. Business Europe has consistently supported these measures, particularly in relation to sustainability reporting, corporate compliance, and wider tax simplification, arguing that a more proportionate and coherent regulatory framework is essential to restore the EU's global competitiveness, attract investment, and support long-term economic growth. Mariella, what in your opinion is standing in the way of achieving these goals?
Yes, I think you have summarized the situation very well. And I have to say that the genesis of the work that Business Europe has been doing in the last year and a half, let's say, has certainly been the Draghi Report. Why? Because the Draghi Report has really quantified a problem that the business has been raising for a very long time, which is that you have the GDP gap between the EU and the US that has doubled from 15% to 30%, and that is from 2002 to 2023. And crucially, what Mario Draghi talked about was that you have roughly 70% of that gap that comes down to productivity. So that is not something that's driven by the demographics or geography or trade patterns. It's the productivity. And in simple terms, therefore, it's how much output do you get for every hour that is worked. And in Europe is generating less value than other parts of the world. And this is a problem. Now, a significant part of what is driving that gap is what we call the regulatory burden. We talk a lot about regulatory burden in Business Europe because this is really one of the pains of businesses operating, especially in more than one European member states. And so they have to work with fragmented rules. And if you are present in more than one member state, then it means that you have to work with a patchwork of compliance obligations. And that means that if you are, for example, a small or medium-sized businesses, the compliance cost can be quite tough to manage. Indeed, Draghi called it a regulatory tsunami. So that really, I think, illustrates the situation that we are in. And he put a number on it that I think it is worth pausing on, which is based on IMF estimates. So he described the barriers, the internal barriers within Europe, as equivalent to a 45% tariff on manufactured goods and 110% tariff on services. So that's quite substantial. And at a time when in the world we are consumed with the debate on US tariffs on Europe, for example, we have a situation where Europe is imposing on itself barriers that dwarf all of the external tariffs, so from the inside. And so what Draghi did very well is that he, amongst other things, obviously, he succeeded in creating a lot of political momentum for simplification and competitiveness. We are in a stage where there is institutional backing. You will have seen, for example, at the beginning of this legislative cycle, each commissioner was tasked with achieving more simplification and competitiveness. And that's new. That's not something we've seen before. And that's something that requires or deserves to be acted upon.
Very true, Mariella. And in fact, against this background, Business Europe has contributed extensively to consultation processes, and I understand that you have been instrumental in formulating tax position papers and submissions over the past years. And to pick a few during this podcast, let's start with the October 2025 position paper called Safeguarding Europe's Competitiveness with Strategic Tax Measures for a Disruptive Global Landscape. So Business Europe argues that EU tax policies should shift decisively towards simplification, legal certainty, and investment-friendly measures in order to avoid placing European businesses at a structural disadvantage in an increasingly competitive global environment. Would you like to expand upon the key asks by Business Europe in the report, and how can we simplify tax measures to make Europe more competitive?
Yes, this is a question that we have reflected upon extensively with the members of our working group that come from very different national federations and from different companies who are all exposed to tax challenges, let's say. And so the paper that we came up with focused or built on the diagnosis that we were talking about earlier to make a very specific tax argument, which is that Europe has essentially signed up in good faith to a global corporate minimum tax agreement. In good faith, assuming that this was going to be a global project. We implemented it fully and on time, despite the fact that I have to say that business groups were very vocal, urging the Commission to wait and see what other competitors are going to be doing. But we are where we are. And we know that major competitors, including the US and China, have not followed through and will not follow through. And so the result of that is that you have European businesses that are carrying a burden that was supposed to be shared globally, but they are left alone carrying that burden. Now, to address that imbalance, we put forward this sort of compensation approach that needs to be given to European businesses. And that, in our view, should be given through three strands. First and foremost, the simplification, the meaningful simplification of the Pillar 2 rules, the minimum tax rules. And by the way, this is something that was explicitly mentioned in the G7 declaration of June 2025. So we're not expecting anything that hasn't been politically committed to. Now, Partially, let's say this has been addressed through the side-by-side package. I'd say partially because it was a step forward in the sense that it removed that immediate threat of having a retaliatory tariff, which would have killed European businesses. And that is something that obviously we were trying to avoid at all costs. But if we step back and look where we are at right now, we know that we're recording this at the end of May. So the first filing deadline for Pillar 2 returns is the end of June. So 5-6 weeks away, less than that. And a large number of jurisdictions, we know that they are not yet ready operationally. Now, this week, actually, the OECD has announced some temporary relief for that, which is welcome, by the way, but the filing deadlines remain unchanged, and the amount of relief that businesses can get depends on what each jurisdiction can give through its own national law. So the bottom line is on that yes, the OECD has eased some pressure, but I think surely the first season of filing is going to be difficult, and I think there is still a gap between what was agreed politically and what still exists in practice. So that's the first strand. The second strand is really the broader simplification of the EU tax framework. This is a topic that is very, very close to our heart, that we have focused extensively on, and we'll talk about this in more detail, and I'll also talk about why simplification is important, even when you consider the broader competitiveness arguments that we assessed in a separate publication that we have carried out and published in Business Europe, which is the Reform Barometer. But the reality is that even before Pillar 2 was introduced, we had a framework that was already very complex. And so when Pillar 2 was introduced, I like to call it the mother of all complexities, because somebody explained to me that Pillar 2 makes the ATAD rules look very simple.
It's the cherry on the cake. No?
Exactly. And I think it is also important to explain what we as a business group understand by simplification, because what it could mean for me might not be the same for you. I think we're on the same lines, but essentially we like referring to the commitments that have been made by the Commission to reduce the administrative burden by 25% for companies and 35% for SMEs. This is a very important commitment, and we'll need to see how the simplification proposals match against those commitments. But it's not just that. So even the member states, back under the Polish presidency, so that would have been somewhere in the first half of 2025, they asked in the Council conclusions, they asked the Commission to deliver an ambitious tax decluttering plan. And what they meant was that they wanted to remove the redundant obligations and remove the overlaps. So it's very clear we have the commitments there, and what we'll need to assess is whether businesses, once we get the proposals and once they are translated into national legislation, will be able to feel, let's say, a measurable reduction in their compliance burden. The third strand is the importance of promoting a genuinely pro-investment agenda. This is something that I think in Europe we are focused a lot on damage limitation, whereas in other parts of the world you get a lot of carrots. You know, come here, invest here.
Growth.
This is what you'll get. Exactly. And that means, for example, eliminating withholding taxes. Do we need that on intra-EU flows? Can we address the tax barriers for cross-border remote workers, for example? This is a very important topic. We've also talked about pursuing policies to the extent that budget revenues can support that of, for example, accelerated depreciation and immediate expensing. Those are the type of policies that directly improve the investment climate, and they send a signal that businesses can be confident to invest and grow here rather than elsewhere.
Very true. And in fact, speaking so extensively about reporting obligations, one of the priorities currently under discussion is the consolidation and simplification of tax transparency initiatives, right? Primarily driven by the proposed recast of the Directive on Administrative Cooperation, which we will fondly call DAC. henceforth. In its contribution to the Commission's public consultation, Business Europe welcomed the initiative. It supports the objective of achieving measurable reductions in administrative burden while strengthening effective, proportionate and risk-based administration. It is clear that the ask is not to weaken tax transparency initiatives. Rather, the recurring concern from businesses and professional bodies is that successive DAC amendments, we're at 9 now, have created overlapping reporting obligations, legal uncertainty due to inconsistent implementation across member states, and disproportionate compliance costs and burdens. So, Mariella, let's recall the context behind the DAC to help place it, and perhaps you could share with us Business Europe's position on the recast and any latest timeline updates you have from Brussels.
Yes, okay. So I think it is important to draw on the context because it also explains why Business Europe has been pushing a lot for simplification. And I think it's useful to go back to a moment in time which changed everything. And that wasn't a legislative moment, but it was a financial one, the 2008 financial crisis. And what the crisis did beyond the immediate economic devastation, right? It fundamentally shifted the political mood around taxation. So suddenly, this idea that you have large companies or wealthy individuals that were not paying their fair share of taxes, and that aggressive tax planning was draining the public revenues that governments really needed at that point in time, that suddenly became politically explosive. And then the governments acted. And we saw how the OECD came up with the BEPS 1 project, 15 actions ranging from hybrid mismatches, transfer pricing, documentation country by country. Quite an impressive project. And of course, the EU was a first mover. So we got the ATAD 1, and then we got the ATAD 2, and then the DACs. So a range of information to be exchanged automatically and reported. As you said, we went all the way to DAC 9. The problem is that whereas each of those initiatives might have had a legitimate justification, because I'm not sure that all of them did, the problem is that in Europe, we don't have a system whereby we go back and say, let's subtract. No, we add, and we add. And there is no mechanism whereby we say, before we introduce this new rule, can we go back and see if the previous 3 still make sense? Can we have a sunset clause, for example? Can we have a proportionality review that is built in? So by the time we got to 2021, 2022, you have European businesses that are navigating ATAD on top of DAC, on top of transfer pricing, on top of country-by-country reporting. And that, just as those layers have settled, the OECD comes up with Pillar 2. And as we said before, the mother of all complexities. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place of an accumulated decade of anti-avoidance legislation, a global minimum tax that is still settling and that is far from global, and also an international framework that I have to say is under unprecedented pressure. Okay. And the compliance cost of that is really significant. Now, the Commission has committed to proposing 2 important proposals, which we are expecting on the 24th of June. And they are the DAC recast, as you rightly said. So that is essentially going to be a consolidation, we understand, of all the DACs. And then also an attempt to revise the rules and see what is still effective, what is proportionate, how can certain compliance obligations be simplified, removed, etc. And on the other hand, in parallel, on the same day, a tax omnibus proposal. That is expected to address the broader tax concerns that come up through the implementation of Pillar 2. So how is the interaction of Pillar 2 with other tax directives, ATAD and the old tax directives primarily? And yes, I think that is expected to go through, just like the other omnibus packages, through the Foreign Affairs Council. So it will be dealt with by a different audience than the traditional way of dealing with tax directives, whereas the DAC recast is expected to go through the ECOFIN Council. So that will be dealt with by the finance ministers, essentially.
Thanks for that. Let's pick up both points you mentioned. So let's pick up the DAC 6 point and also the tax omnibus point. So if we had to first pick up the DAX 6 point, so which in my opinion is one of the most contentious at the moment in terms of the whole recast of the DAC directive. So DAX 6 for our audience introduced immediate reporting requirements on advisors and businesses upon perceived aggressive tax planning strategies with minimal basis, if I can say so, on a real abuse of law. So Business Europe has highlighted the disproportionate nature of the relevant disclosure and their impact on the business community in Europe, on the competitiveness of business in Europe, particularly in the light of the potential extension of DAX 6 to unshell hallmarks. That said, for the recast to be unanimously adopted, a compromise must be sought. The extension of the hallmarks to substance criteria would also entail agreement unless delegated to soft law issued by the Commission. So member states and tax professionals are asking for greater support from the taxpayer in undertaking the reporting and also broadening reporting timeframes. And if my understanding is correct, Business Europe specifically highlights the difficulties with rationalizing the cost and complexity of the overlapping nature of the reporting requirements under the phased DAC approach, and several submissions advocate centralized group reporting, simplified notification, enhanced digitalization. Business Europe has raised concerns also regarding disproportionate penalties, retrospective reporting expectations, and importantly, insufficient taxpayer safeguards in practice. So, Mariella, against this background and recognizing the political objective of preserving effective administrative cooperation within the EU, where does Business Europe see the appropriate balance between transparency and competitiveness in the DAC recast negotiations?
Okay, so I'll try to condense this as much as possible because we could spend the rest of the day here talking about this. But you have rightly said DAC 6 is one of our biggest priorities. We consider it the single largest source of administrative burden within the DAC framework. And our members tell me from all the national federations consistently how painful it is, because it means that businesses have to submit a lot of transactions and they believe that the tax authority doesn't do much with them. As you know, the hallmarks are drafted very broadly and they trigger, therefore, a number of standard commercial transactions that would not be driven by aggressive tax reasons. They would just be standard routine commercial transactions. And I know this not only from the policy side. Before I moved to Brussels, I was working in-house at Bank of America in London. And I was at the time there when DAC 6 came into force, and this was, well, it didn't come into force at the end, but I'll talk through that later. But we were advising business units how to actually implement it. And I have to say that it was an overwhelming experience, not because we didn't have the resources to do it, but because of the uncertainty. And we spent a lot of time documenting why things are not reportable. So we weren't identifying tax schemes. We were just demonstrating the absence of aggression. And that, to me, is a compliance system that has lost its proportionality. And this is why, as a group, we argue that, look, the policy rationale for DAC 6 has moved on. We're not in 2018 anymore. Tell me what Pillar 2 and ATAD are not doing that the DAC is doing, because there is zero evidence that DAC 6 is effective for capturing some form of aggressive tax arrangements. Now, the argument to that we usually get is that DAC 6 is effective because it deters the aggressive tax behavior. I do not agree. And I think that we need to go back to the roots of all this discussion to determine how best to find the balance to simplify it. And the roots are the OECD mandatory disclosure rules, so the international standards that the EU committed to. And that covers hallmarks D1 and D2, CRS avoidance schemes, and opaque offshore structures. Anything else that was added by the EU unilaterally, and the businesses have been paying for that ever since they added those additions. Now, I also like to talk through an example that we have of having the mandatory disclosure rules of the OECD, which is exactly the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom, when it left the EU framework, it aligned with the OECD standards. And since then, the feedback that we have is that there is no concern of missing arrangements. So you have an example of a sophisticated tax authority in a major economy operating under a simplified regime and flagging no consents. Now, what the British do is that they have a domestic mandatory regime, DOTAS and POTAS, but those are not comparable to DAC 6 because they are focused around the promoters of the schemes, so the people who come up and design and market the scheme, not the businesses that are using it. So the impact of that is that if you look in a specific year, 2024, for example, there were 30 notifiable schemes domestically. Compare that with the mass reporting of transactions under DAC 6. And I think this speaks for itself as to how you effectively deter aggressive tax behavior. The second point that we talked about is this importance of having more streamlining of notification requirements where there are some duplications. And in that respect, we identified some similarities, some duplications under DAC 4 and DAC 9. We understand that the Commission is taking that direction. This is very good news. This should be the approach that will be taken forward, and that is a very positive signal. And I think on the DAC, whatever remains in it has to be objectively efficient and proportionate. So we can't have penalties, for example, that are sort of very disproportionate for a minor filing error. That is clearly disproportionate. The ambition, ideally, would be to have more binding guidance, for example. But let's see how far we are able to get there. And maybe a little word on Unshell. Of course, we don't view the inclusion of Unshell as a form of obtaining simplification because this is a directive that has been specifically rejected. It was overly broad, and adding it to the DAC recast would go against the whole objective of simplification.
A last word about the timeline, perhaps?
Yes, well, the timeline remains the 24th of June, but again, that is the first step. It will have to be then dealt with by Council.
100%. So quickly picking up on the second point you mentioned earlier. So earlier this year, Business Europe also contributed to the call for evidence on the European Commission's report on simplifying measures on direct taxation, a new omnibus on direct taxation. The Commission has set targets to reduce the administrative burden by at least 25%, as we've been saying, on businesses, and at least 35% for SMEs. And in fact, in the 2026 Commission work programme, the Commission mentioned that it intends to propose an omnibus directive by June 2026, so in a few weeks, with the aim to streamline directives such as interest royalties, tax merger, parent sub, ATAD, and dispute resolution directive. So what is the stance of Business Europe? What are the key messages set out in your submission? And has any feedback been received from the Commission?
Yes, first of all, we think that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There is institutional backing for simplification and competitiveness, as we talked about. And so the window is open right now, but it won't remain open indefinitely. So the time to act is now. We focused on 4 priorities, essentially. First of all, the interaction between CFC and Pillar 2. This is important. You have companies where they are required to calculate 2 separate tax bases. They can get the credits back, but they do not get a credit for the compliance burden. And so it doesn't make sense that you have to have 2 separate calculations in parallel. The interest limitation rule, this is also a sensitive one for our members, especially right now, given the economic environment that we are in. That rule obviously restricts access to financing precisely at the moment when you need it most, and you have capital-intensive businesses that really need to borrow to grow, essentially, or to invest in the green transition or to invest in defense. So that needs updating because it hasn't been touched, and the rule was no longer reflects reality. The old tax directives, I like to call them,
the 1990 package and the 1997, yes.
Yes. Which reminds me that I'm around of that
yes,
age.
Well, let's skip that part.
But yes, so those essentially we talk about the fact that they do not reflect indeed the modern realities of corporate structures, and they need to be updated. Ideally, eliminating the intra-EU withholding tax flows within the EU. This is a very important signal. There is the concept of beneficial ownership, which remains difficult to to harmonize in concept. Okay, so you have, for example, difficulties where companies just decide to do away with the withholding tax refunds because the penalties could even be criminal. And so why should I end up in jail just, because of concerns that I am not really the beneficial ownership? So a little bit of proportionality there. And then perhaps also the dispute resolution mechanism. The disputes are not going away in any shape or form. They're increasing. So this is going to be important. We understand from the Commission that they understand businesses' constraints. They want to act ambitiously, but obviously, as we say, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So we will be waiting for the proposal.
Very much so. So in concluding finally and very briefly, let's circle back to the competitiveness agenda and discuss the Business Europe Reform Barometer. So Business Europe publishes an annual competitiveness assessment, and almost a year and a half after the publication of the Draghi Report, in March, Business Europe publishes 2026 Reform Barometer. And my understanding of the position in the report, entitled 18 months after Draghi from diagnosis to delivery, is that while Europe has broadly understood the competitiveness diagnosis made by the Draghi report, implementation is still too slow, fragmented and insufficient. And the proof is now in delivery. So while a majority of businesses hold a more favourable view of the Commission's competitiveness agenda compared to last year, only 19% report an improved investment environment, and European growth is projected to remain subdued, with the IMF forecasting only an uncertain 1.3% growth rate for the European Union. Against these findings of the Reform Barometer, and in the light of the continued gap between the improving sentiment towards the EU competitiveness agenda and the limited improvement on the ground, where does Business Europe see the most binding constraint today?
Yes, my colleagues in the economics department did extensive work on this with our members. And as you say, the headline finding was brutally honest and very uncomfortable, in the sense that indeed there is the political ambition, but the delivery is still very slow. And the context in which all of this is playing out has actually become more difficult, not less. So the geopolitical environment, the trade tensions, the fragmented global supply chains, those are all adding pressure on European businesses precisely at the time when the internal framework should be making their lives easier, not harder. So we have put a number of messages there to the policymakers, and we have also come up with a separate 140 concrete proposals on how to achieve more simplification and reduce the regulatory burden. The omnibus packages needs to be completed first and foremost, and they need to keep going. So there is obviously the issue of energy costs that needs to be addressed, the volatility problem, the labor availability, the savings and investment union, which needs to be completed, because the gap in private investment will not close only by political declaration. So I want to close by saying something that I think runs beneath all of this, and that is that this is all an exercise about trust in our public authorities, because if what is promised as simplification doesn't feel like simplification on the ground, the businesses will notice that. And that gap between what was promised and what was delivered is precisely where the trust in this process will erode.
100%, Mariella. I think to wrap this up and to bring this all together, today's discussion has truly highlighted the continued efforts for Europe's competitiveness ambitions to meet the practical reality faced by businesses in navigating an increasingly complex regulatory and tax environment. The Reform Barometer and related Business Europe contributions consistently point to the need for faster implementation, greater simplification, and essentially a more coherent policy design across the single market. Ultimately, progress on these fronts will be decisive in determining whether the EU can translate its competitiveness agenda into tangible improvements in investment conditions and long-term growth. Mariella, grazie. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to share your valuable insights with us and for a most engaging discussion throughout this podcast.
Thanks to you, Trudy. Thank you. These are necessary conversations, not only to have with policymakers, but I think also with practitioners, business operators. It is really important to speak with those who engage with the rules on a daily basis, because that is what helps us in Business Europe make legitimate and forward-looking and constructive arguments.
And I thank you for that. And also, a particular word of appreciation goes to the Malta IFA branch, its Win and Yin factions, and Chris Kurmi, Malta IFA chair. And thank you also to Sigma World once again.